それではこれよりハーバード大学のジョセフ・ナイ先生よりご講演をいただきます。ナイ先生には例年通り来日してご講演をいただく予定でしたが、新型コロナウイルス感染症の影響を鑑みまして、アメリカからリモートでのご登壇を賜ることといたしました。ご理解のほど何卒よろしくお願いいたします。ナイ先生はアメリカ国際政治学の重鎮の一人で、パワーと相互依存、ソフトパワー、スマートパワーなど斬新な概念を数多く創出してこられました。また歴代のアメリカ民主党政権で国防次官補などの要職を務められました。さらに知日派の国際政治学者として日米関係に関するさまざまな政策提言をされています。演題は中国の台頭と歴史からの教訓です。それではナイ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
It's a pleasure to be back with my friends at Tokyo International University. I'm just sorry that I'm not in Tokyo itself. It's such a wonderful city, and I always enjoy my visits, but at least this virtual opportunity will allow me to congratulate Chancellor Kuroda again, and also to join him in the tribute he paid to our friend Okamoto Yukio. I was deeply shocked and pained by his loss to COVID. So we are poorer for his absence, but I am glad to be at least back with TIU in this virtual format. I was planning to think with you about the lessons of history that are applied to the rise of China. It's very popular now in Washington to appeal to these sorts of lessons. But I am going to warn you that you have to be careful. The rise of China to being the second largest economy in the world has been truly impressive. Some people think that China will displace the US as the world's leading power by 2049. Indeed, Kimura-san referred to that possibility. But the outcome will depend on many unknowns, including what the two countries will do over the next 3 decades. Some see China declining after failing to escape the middle income trap. In other words, it's not inevitable that China will pass the US. And even others believe that Xi Jinping's dream, his so-called China dream, may not come true because it could be falsified by unexpected events. For example, if there was a war over Taiwan, or if there was a deep financial crisis, all these predictions of China's inevitable rise might prove to be false. There is never one future when we try to understand the world. There are many possible scenarios, and which of those scenarios becomes the most probable depends very much on what we do. So the policies we choose are very important. What then is the policy that the United States should choose in response to the rise of China? Analysts often turn to the lessons of history as though the bright light of the past could shine through the fog of an uncertain future. While history is an important partial guide to policy, it must be handled with care. All too often, history lessons are oversimplified and misused as though the future will resemble the past. As one of my colleagues, the distinguished historian Ernest May, used to remark, every time that a policymaker is tempted to be guided by a historical analogy, they should draw a line down a piece of paper and list on one side of the line things that are similar, and on the other side of the line things that are different. Historical metaphors and analogies are rife now, as I mentioned, in the debate over how to understand and respond to the current rise of China. But there are three that have been particularly prominent in recent years in trying to guide policy. Those three are what is sometimes called a Thucydides trap. Second one is the idea of a new Cold War, repeating the Cold War. And the third is what might be based on 1914 and World War I and be called a sleepwalker scenario. I'm going to discuss each of these three historical analogies in turn and explain to you why I don't think they give us the full answers to how we should respond to the rise of China. Then at the conclusion, I will tell you what I think is the appropriate way to respond. Let me start with the so-called Thucydides trap. Thucydides, of course, was the ancient Greek historian who explained the Peloponnesian War, in which the Greek city-state system tore itself apart. And in that sense, it's very frequent that you'll hear people today talk about the similarities about the rise of China with the rise of Athens in ancient Greece. It's interesting that even Xi Jinping himself has referred to the Thucydides trap. Thucydides argued that the underlying causes of this Peloponnesian War was the rise in the power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta. By analogy, people who look at the US and China today say that a war might be caused by the rise in the power of China and the fear that it creates in the United States. Fewer people follow the advice of my colleague Ernest May and note the differences in the roles, such as the fact that Athens was a democracy while China is an autocracy, that Sparta was an inward-looking land power, while the US is a global naval power. And they also fail to remember the dramatic differences in the context of international relations, such as the existence of nuclear weapons or the problem of global climate change. Indeed, there are some historians and policymakers who argue that if you look at China and the US today, a case can be made that it is China which is a peaking or declining power and not the US. And that they say, for example, the historian Hal Brands and political scientist Michael Beckley argue that China, a war between the US and China could arise from Chinese elite fears that its window of opportunity is closing. My Harvard colleague Graham Allison deserves credit for trying to quantify historical cases of what's called hegemonic transition from one leading state to another since the year 1500. And he claims that he has found 16 such cases, and that in 12 of the 16 cases, there has been a major war. On the other hand, many other social scientists have questioned his case selection and methodology. It's not at all clear what he means by a case. For example, in the 19th century, Britain was the dominant world power, but it let Prussia create the powerful new German Empire in the heart of Europe as Germany waged 3 wars from which Britain abstained. If it had really been that afraid of Germany at that time, it could have participated in that and prevented the reformulation of the German Empire. Of course, Britain did fight Germany a half century later in 1914, but it should be a question for us whether that is one case or 4 cases, or how many cases is that. In addition to the fact that it's difficult to identify a case, which calls into question Allison's statistics about 3/4 of the cases leading to war, the most important case of World War I is much more complex than just thinking of it in terms of a Thucydides trap. For example, in addition to the rise of Germany creating fear in Britain, the Germans were afraid of rising Russian power. And then the Austrians were afraid of rising Slavic nationalism in the Balkans, as well as myriad other factors. So historical analogies that say this is an inevitable way in which hegemonic transitions turn out are simply likely to be misleading because of such differences. Now, today's power gap between the United States and China is much greater than that between Germany and Britain, where Germany had already passed Britain well before 1914. Even the classical Greek case that Thucydides wrote about is not as straightforward as Thucydides made it seem. He claimed that the cause of the second of the two Peloponnesian Wars, the disastrous one, was the growth in the power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta. But the Yale historian, Donald Kagan, argues that Athenian power, in fact, was not growing. Before the war broke out in 431 BC, the balance of power had begun to stabilize in ancient Greece. It was Athenian policy mistakes that made the Spartans think that war might be worth the risk. Indeed, there had been a truce after the First Peloponnesian War, which had calmed things down or doused the fire. Kagan argues that to start the second disastrous war, a spark was needed to land on one of the rare bits of kindling that had not been thoroughly drenched and then continuously and vigorously fanned by poor policy choices. In other words, war was caused not by impersonal forces or inevitable forces, but by bad decisions in difficult circumstances. So what should a policymaker conclude are the lessons of history for how the US today should respond to a rising China? If the Peloponnesian War was caused in part by the rise of Athenian power, it was also caused by the fear created in Sparta. American policymakers may not be able to control the rise in the power of China, but they can affect the degree of fear that it creates in Washington. Exaggerated fears can mobilize domestic support, but if the fears are excessive and lead to miscalculation, that would be the ultimate Thucydides trap. Metaphors from Greek history can be useful as general precautions, but they become dangerous if they can convey a sense of historical inevitability. The other problem with the Thucydides trap is that explaining hegemonic transition outcomes is that there's a second problem related to the rise of China that I've called the Kindleberger trap, which I named after the famous MIT economist Charles Kindleberger. Kindleberger studied the disastrous decade of the 1930s and the Great Depression, and he said it was caused when the US replaced Britain as the biggest global power, but failed to take on Britain's role in providing global public goods. The result was the collapse of the global system into depression, genocide, and world war. Today, as China's power grows, will China help to provide global public goods? At the global level, public goods such as a stable climate, financial stability, or freedom of the seas are usually provided by a coalition led by the largest powers because they can see the effect and feel the benefit of their contributions. But when these powers do not produce global goods, they are underproduced. When Britain became The too weak to play that role after World War I, an isolationist US continued to be a free rider with disastrous effects. As China's power grows, will it free ride rather than contribute to an international order that it did not create? So far, the record is mixed. China benefits from the UN system, where it has a veto in the Security Council and is now the second largest funder of UN peacekeeping forces and heads 4 of the 15 most important UN agencies. China also has benefited from multilateral economic institutions like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. But China has also tried to create its own funds. This is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and it's also developed its own Belt and Road Initiative. And in addition to that, China has rejected the arbitration of a permanent court of arbitration on the law of the sea regarding territorial claims in the South China Sea. So the key question we have to ask is not just whether we're going to avoid a Thucydides trap, but are we going to avoid a Kindleberger trap? What are the lessons of history then on how to deal with a rising China? Ancient Greek history and its relevance to the onset of the 2 world wars provides at best cautionary notes, but not answers. The policymakers must worry about China that is simultaneously too weak and too strong, and must avoid both the Kindleberger trap as well as the Thucydides trap. The second historical analogy that's become very popular in Washington and elsewhere is the analogy of repeating the Cold War. The rhetoric of Cold War is useful for political leaders to mobilize domestic political support, but the metaphor has also been advocated by some scholars to predict a prolonged conflict. Some say that President Trump launched a new Cold War, but Trump was not the sole source of the problem. He merely poured gas on a smoldering fire, but it was China which really lit the fire. After the Great Recession of 2008, and which called American leadership into question, China increased its belief in American decline, and Chinese leaders abandoned Deng Xiaoping's moderate policy of biding their time and became more assertive in ways ranging from building artificial islands in the South China Sea to economic coercion of Australia to abrogating guarantees to Hong Kong. On the trade front, China tilted the playing field with subsidies to state-owned enterprises and coercive intellectual property transfer. Trump clumsily responded with a tariff war that included penalties on our allies as well as China, but he correctly defended against Chinese companies like Huawei, whose plans to build fifth-generation telecommunications networks posed a security threat. Some people in Washington began to talk about a general decoupling from China, but it's mistaken to think that we can decouple our economy completely from China without enormous economic costs. That's why the Cold War metaphor misleads policymakers about the nature of the challenge that we face from China. In the real Cold War, the Soviet Union was a direct military and ideological threat, and the US had almost no economic or social interdependence in our relationship. Containment was a feasible objective. With China today, the US has $500 billion in trade and millions of social interchanges, such as students and visitors. China has learned to harness the creativity of markets to authoritarian Communist Party control in a way that the Soviet Union never mastered. China cannot be contained in the same manner as the relatively weak Soviet economy. Moreover, the US and its allies are not threatened by the export of communism in the same way as in the days of Stalin or Mao Zedong. There is less proselytizing today than during the Cold War. Few people today are taking to the streets or jungles in favor of Xi Jinping thought. Instead, the problem we face is a hybrid system of economic and political interdependence, which China can manipulate to support authoritarian governments and influence in opinion in democratic countries to prevent criticisms of China. Witness its punishment of Norway, South Korea, and Australia. As mentioned earlier, China has become the leading trade partner of more countries than is the United States. Partial decoupling on security issues like Huawei is useful, but total economic decoupling would not only be costly, but unlike the Cold War, few allies would follow suit. Moreover, there are ecological aspects of interdependence today, such as climate change and pandemics, which are governed by the laws of physics and biology, which make decoupling impossible. No country can solve these transnational problems alone. The politics of global interdependence involve power with others as well as over others. For better and worse, we're locked in a cooperative rivalry with China, in which we need a strategy that can accomplish two seemingly contradictory things at the same time: cooperation and rivalry. This is not like the Cold War containment. Meeting the China challenge will require a more complex strategy that leverages US hard and soft power resources at home and abroad to defend ourselves and strengthen a rules-based international system. Some pessimists look at China's population size and economic growth rates and believe that the task is impossible. On the contrary, if we treat our allies as assets, the combined wealth of Western democracies, US, Japan, and Europe, will far exceed that of China well into the century. But our allies do not all see China in exactly the same way as we do. Our rhetoric of Cold War may have more negative than positive effects on the maintenance of our alliance. The third historical analogy that I want to alert you to, that's being talked about in Washington, is the 1914 World War I analogy and what is sometimes be called sleepwalking. The fact that the Cold War metaphor is counterproductive as a strategy doesn't mean we can rule it out entirely. We may get there by accident. As Henry Kissinger has warned, the appropriate historical analogy may not be 1945, but 1914, when all the great powers expected a short Third Balkan War. Instead, they got a World War I, which led to 4 years and collapse of 4 empires. So leaders paid insufficient attention to the changes that altered the process of the international order that they had once called the concert of Europe. One important change was the growing strength of nationalism. In Eastern Europe, Pan-Slavism threatened both the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, which each had large Slavic populations. German authors started to talk and write about the inevitability of Teutonic Slavic battles, and school books became inflamed with nationalistic passions. Nationalism proved much stronger than socialism when it came to bonding together working classes. A second cause of loss of moderation in the early 20th century balance of power was the rise of a complacency about peace. The great powers had not been involved in a war in Europe for 40 years. There have been crises, but they'd overcome them. Many leaders believed that short, decisive wars won by the strong would be a welcome change. And a third factor that caused the loss of flexibility in the early 20th century was German policy, which was ambitious but vague and confusing. There was a terrible clumsiness about the Kaiser's policy of seeking greater power. Something similar can be seen with Xi Jinping's China Dream, his abandonment of Deng's patient approach, as well as excesses of nationalism in China today, which have given rise to what's called wolf warrior diplomacy. Policymakers must be alert to the rise of nationalism in China, as well as populist nationalism in other countries like the United States. Compared with the clumsiness of China's wolf warrior diplomacy, a history of standoffs and compromises over Taiwan American efforts to reassure Taiwan could lead to inadvertent escalation. The historian Christopher Clark summarized the situation in 1914 as saying that it was not inevitable, that the future was still open, but that mistakes were made. And therefore, what we should learn from 1914, from this third historical analogy, is that the successful strategy must protect against such a sleepwalker syndrome. In 1914, Austria was fed up with upstart Serbia's nationalism, and the assassination of an Austrian archduke by a Serbian terrorist was a perfect pretext for an ultimatum. Before he left for a vacation, the German Kaiser decided to deter a rising Russia and back his Austrian ally by issuing them a blank check. When he returned and found out how Austria had filled it out, he tried to retract that, but it was too late. So as the US hopes to deter the use of force by China and preserve the legal limbo of Taiwan, we have to be very careful. Our policy is now designed both to deter Taiwan's declaration of de jure independence as well as Beijing's use of force. Now, some analysts warn that the double deterrence policy is outdated, but others believe that an outright guarantee to Taiwan would provoke China to act. Even if China avoids a full-scale invasion and tries to coerce Taiwan with a blockade or taking an offshore island, if there's a ship or aircraft collision that leads to a loss of life, all bets are off. If the US reacts with freezing of assets or invoking the Trading with the Enemy Act, the two Cold Wars could quite quickly slip into a real rather than a metaphorical cold or even a hot war. So the lessons of 1914 are to be wary of sleepwalking, even though they don't provide a solution to the Taiwan problem. So let me conclude by saying that since there's no single future, a good strategy must allow for multiple possibilities and multiple scenarios, some of which we can affect and some of which are largely beyond our control. Rather than planning for maximal outcomes, which may fall short, our objective should be competitive coalition in what former Prime Minister Abe dubbed a free and open Indo-Pacific. That's a goal which we can use to rally allies. As former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd argued, the objective for great power competition with China is not defeat or total victory, but a managed competition. A sound strategy requires us to avoid demonization of China and instead see the relationship as a cooperative rivalry or competitive coexistence. If China changes for the better in the long run, that's an unexpected bonus. So a successful American strategy must start at home and be based on preserving our democratic institutions, investing in research and development that retains our technological advantage, and maintaining our openness to the world rather than retreating behind a curtain of fear. And externally, a sound strategy must restructure our legacy military forces, strengthen our alliance structures, including NATO, Japan, Australia, and Korea, enhance our relations with India, and strengthen our participation in and supplement the existing set of international institutions we've created to set standards and manage interdependence. And then finally, we have to cooperate with China where it's possible on issues of transnational interdependence, such as pandemics or climate. In the near term, given the assertive policies of the Xi Jinping government, we will probably have to spend more time on the rivalry side of the equation. But if we avoid ideological demonization and misleading Cold War analogies and maintain our alliances, particularly our alliance with Japan, the most important lesson of history is that we concede with such a realistic, no regret strategy. That is the most important lesson of history from my point of view. Thank you very much for listening.
内先生、ありがとうございました。